Elena Winters stood by the huge windows of her top-floor New York apartment, looking at the city lights below. The lights twinkled like the expensive diamonds she wore on her wrist. The diamond bracelet was a gift from her husband Richard on their 5th wedding anniversary 3 years ago. He hadn't even been there to give it to her in person. His assistant had delivered it with a card signed in handwriting that wasn't his. At 34, Elena had what most people would dream of having. Her husband Richard ran a successful money business worth billions. Their daughter Harper, a sweet 5-year-old with golden curls, attended the most exclusive preschool in Manhattan. Elena's face often appeared in fancy magazines that showed off their perfect home and life. But standing there watching Harper play alone with her dolls in the corner of their spotless living room, Elena felt an empty feeling in her chest that wouldn't go away. "Mommy, look. Daisy is having a tea party," Harper called out, holding up her favorite doll. The little girl had set up a tiny table with plastic teacups for her stuffed animals. Elena smiled and walked over, careful not to wrinkle her designer dress. She had a charity dinner tonight, another event where she'd stand beside Richard and smile while he talked business with people who never bothered to ask her anything about herself. "That looks wonderful, sweetheart," Elena said, sitting down on the plush carpet. "May I join the party?" Harper's face lit up. These moments were rare. Usually at this time, Harper would be with Greta, the nanny, while Elena got ready for some event. As Elena pretended to sip from the tiny plastic cup, her phone buzzed. Richard's message was short. "Emergency investor meeting. Won't make dinner. Have Robert drive you." Elena set down the cup, trying to hide her disappointment from Harper. "Is Daddy coming home soon?" the little girl asked, too smart to miss her mother's changed mood. "Not tonight, honey. Daddy has to work again." The words felt hollow, just like every other excuse she'd made for Richard over the years. Their marriage hadn't always been this way. 8 years ago, when they met at an art gallery where Elena worked after finishing her art history degree, Richard had been charming and interested in her thoughts about the paintings. He'd asked her questions and really listened to her answers. But somewhere between the wedding, Harper's birth, and Richard's company growing bigger and bigger, something had changed. Now, their conversations were about schedules, social events, and Harper's education. The house staff raised their daughter while Richard worked 18-hour days. Elena maintained the perfect image of a billionaire's wife, always well-dressed, polite, and forgettable. "Ms. Winters, your dress for tonight has been pressed. Would you like me to help you get ready?" Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway. Elena looked at Harper, who had already turned back to her dolls, used to her mother leaving. "Thank you, Maria. Could you give me 10 more minutes with Harper first?" After Maria left, Elena sat back down next to her daughter. "What's Daisy's favorite tea?" she asked. "Strawberry with honey." Harper giggled, her blue eyes, so like Richard's, lighting up. Elena tried to remember the last time she'd heard Richard laugh like that. Probably not since Harper was a baby. Now he was always serious, always busy, always thinking about the next deal. Later, as she rode in the back of their expensive car to the charity dinner she would attend alone, Elena stared at the city passing by outside the window. The driver, Robert, knew better than to try to talk to her. In the quiet of the car, Elena allowed herself to think the thoughts she usually pushed away. She was lonely, so deeply lonely that sometimes it felt hard to breathe. Harper was lonely too, surrounded by toys and staff, but missing real connection. Was this really the life she wanted for her daughter? A beautiful cage filled with expensive things but empty of joy, laughter, and love? The car stopped at a red light. Outside, a young couple walked hand in hand, laughing at something shared between them. They didn't look rich. Their clothes were simple, but they had something Elena couldn't buy with all of Richard's billions. As the light turned green and the car moved forward, Elena made a decision that would shock everyone in her world. She would leave it all behind: the penthouse, the jewelry, the staff, the social position. She would take Harper and find a real life, one filled with small moments of happiness instead of big empty spaces. She would find the woman she used to be before she became Mrs. Richard Winters. The car pulled up to the glittering event venue. As Robert opened her door, Elena stepped out into the flashbulbs of waiting photographers with a smile that hid her secret. This would be one of her last appearances as the billionaire's perfect wife. Soon, she would be free. Elena sat in her lawyer's office, pen in hand, staring at the final divorce papers. The thick stack of documents represented the end of her 8-year marriage to Richard Winters. Outside the large windows, spring sunshine brightened the Manhattan streets, seeming to promise new beginnings. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Winters?" asked Catherine Chen, her lawyer. The older woman's expression showed the same disbelief everyone had when Elena explained what she wanted from the divorce. "Your husband is willing to give you the summer house in the Hamptons, the apartment in Paris, and a much larger monthly allowance. This settlement you've asked for is, well, it's far below what you're entitled to." Elena smiled softly. "I know what I'm doing, Catherine. And please, call me Elena Morgan now." She signed her maiden name at the bottom of the page with a steady hand. "I don't want to be rich anymore. I just want to be happy." 3 months had passed since the night of the charity dinner when Elena had made her decision. Those months had been filled with shocked faces. Her friends, her family, even Richard himself couldn't understand why she would walk away from billions of dollars. "You can have whatever you want," Richard had told her during their first meeting with the lawyers. He looked genuinely confused, his normally confident face showing rare uncertainty. "Is it the house? You don't like the penthouse? We can buy something else. Is it more staff you want? More freedom to travel?" He simply couldn't grasp that what Elena wanted couldn't be bought. How could she explain that all the luxury in the world couldn't fill the emptiness of raising a child in a loveless home? That she was tired of being a decoration in his perfect life picture? "The papers say you're requesting full custody of Harper," Catherine said, pulling Elena back to the present. "Mr. Winters has agreed, with generous visitation rights for himself." Elena nodded. That had been her one non-negotiable demand. She would leave with almost nothing from their marriage except their daughter. Richard had fought this initially, but eventually agreed when his lawyers pointed out how it would look if he tried to take a 5-year-old from her mother, especially when his work schedule left him little time for childcare. He's also added a special trust fund for Harper's education, Catherine continued. "It's quite generous and will ensure she can attend any college she chooses." "That's fine," Elena said. She didn't want to deprive Harper of opportunities, just the cold, empty lifestyle that had come with them. The intercom on Catherine's desk buzzed. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Winters and his legal team have arrived." Elena took a deep breath as the door opened. Richard walked in wearing his usual perfect suit, not a hair out of place. Behind him came 2 serious-looking men carrying briefcases, his lawyers who were probably paid more per hour than most people made in a week. Richard's eyes met Elena's across the room. For a moment, she remembered the man she'd fallen in love with years ago, smart, charming, ambitious. But that man had disappeared slowly, leaving this stranger who worked endlessly and had forgotten how to really see the people around him. "Elena," he said with a nod. No warmth, no anger, just calm politeness, as if they were business associates rather than people who had shared a bed and created a child together. The next hour passed in a blur of legal terms and signatures. Richard signed his name dozens of times without showing any emotion. When it was done, Catherine and the other lawyers stepped out to make copies, leaving Elena and Richard alone for a moment. "The press is already talking," Richard said, breaking the silence. "They're calling you everything from a saint to a complete fool." He straightened his expensive watch. "I still don't understand why you're doing this." Elena looked at him directly. "I know you don't. That's part of the problem. Harper will miss the life she's used to," he tried again. "The best schools, the right friends, the advantages. Harper will have something better," Elena cut in gently. "She'll have a mother who's truly happy. She'll make real friends, not just connections. She'll learn that worth isn't measured by price tags." Richard shook his head. "You'll regret this, Elena. The real world isn't as romantic as you think. You've been protected for years." Elena smiled. "I know it won't be easy. But I lived in the real world before I met you, Richard. I can do it again." When the lawyers returned, final papers were exchanged. It was official. Elena Morgan was no longer Mrs. Richard Winters, Billionaire's wife. She was just Elena again, with a modest bank account, a small SUV instead of a driver, and a future wide open with possibilities. As she walked out of the lawyer's office into the bright spring day, reporters called her name from behind the security barrier. Flashbulbs popped and questions were shouted. "Mrs. Winters, is it true you turned down millions? Elena, why are you walking away from one of the richest men in America? Did he cheat on you? Was there abuse?" Elena simply smiled and kept walking. None of them would understand that sometimes the heaviest chains were made of gold, that some cages were built of luxury and expectations rather than iron bars. Her phone buzzed with a message from the nanny. "Harper's asking when you'll be home. She made you a picture at school today." For the first time in years, Elena felt her heart lighten. Tomorrow, she and Harper would leave New York. They would drive to Cedar Cove, Massachusetts, a small coastal town where Elena's grandmother had once lived. She'd already rented a blue cottage near the beach, enrolled Harper in the local school, and applied for a job at a small art gallery. As she hailed a taxi, Elena noticed a young woman staring at a fashion magazine on a nearby newsstand. Elena's own face looked back from the cover, a photo from some charity event, perfectly dressed, perfectly smiling, perfectly empty. The headline asked, "Billionaire's wife walks away, crazy or brave?" Elena smiled to herself as she got into the taxi. Maybe she was a little of both, but for the first time in years, she was also truly free. "Mom, look. I can see the ocean from my window." Harper pressed her small hands against the glass, her breath making fog circles as she stared in wonder at the view from their new home. Elena smiled as she set down a box labeled kitchen on the worn wooden floor of the blue cottage they'd just rented in Cedar Cove. The house was tiny compared to their Manhattan penthouse, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a cozy living room that opened to a small kitchen. But the windows faced the Atlantic Ocean, and salt-scented breezes blew through the rooms. "Do you like it, sweetheart?" Elena asked, joining her daughter at the window. In the distance, waves crashed against rocks and seagulls circled overhead. Harper nodded enthusiastically. "Can we go to the beach today? Please?" Her blue eyes, so like Richard's, sparkled with excitement. "As soon as we unpack your clothes and make your bed," Elena promised. She still couldn't believe they were really here, 3 hours north of Boston in a tiny coastal town where nobody knew them. She had driven them all the way from New York in their new-to-them SUV, with Harper's favorite stuffed animals and books piled in the back seat. The moving truck had followed with the few things Elena had kept, some clothing, Harper's toys, and personal items with sentimental value. She'd left behind the designer dresses, the expensive furniture, and all the trappings of her former life. The cottage came partially furnished, with simple, slightly shabby pieces that somehow made the place feel more like a home than the perfectly decorated penthouse ever had. The faded blue couch had a sunken spot in the middle. The wooden kitchen table was scratched from years of use. The back door stuck a little when you tried to open it. It was wonderfully imperfect. By afternoon, they had unpacked enough to take a break. Elena changed into jeans and a simple t-shirt, clothes she'd rarely worn in New York, and helped Harper into her swimsuit. "Hold my hand," Elena said as they crossed the street to the path leading down to the beach. The sand was cool beneath their feet, and Harper squealed with delight as they reached the water's edge and tiny waves washed over her toes. "It's cold." Harper giggled, jumping back, then bravely stepping forward again. Elena watched her daughter with a full heart. In Manhattan, Harper's activities had been scheduled and supervised, swimming lessons in heated indoor pools, playdates arranged weeks in advance with the children of Richard's business associates, dance classes with strict instructors who didn't allow parents to watch. Here there was just the ocean, the sand, and freedom. "Hello there, new to town." A friendly voice called from behind them. Elena turned to see a woman about her own age walking toward them. She wore faded jeans rolled up at the ankles and carried a large canvas bag. "I'm Lily," the woman said, extending her hand. "I live in the yellow house up on Pine Street. I think I saw you moving in down the road." Elena shook her hand, feeling oddly nervous. In New York, she'd known exactly how to behave at charity events and dinner parties, but simple neighborly conversation felt foreign now. "I'm Elena, and this is my daughter Harper. We just arrived today." "Welcome to Cedar Cove," Lily smiled. She turned to Harper, who was watching curiously from behind Elena's legs. "The tide pools over by those rocks have the best starfish and tiny crabs, if you're interested." Harper's eyes widened. "Really? Can we go see, Mom? Please?" And just like that, their first afternoon in Cedar Cove turned into a small adventure. Lily showed them the best tide pools, helped Harper spot a bright orange starfish, and pointed out different seashells. By the time the sun started to set, Harper was happily exhausted, her pockets full of smooth stones and shells. The gallery where I work is having a little community art show on Saturday, Lily mentioned as they walked back toward their homes. Very casual, just local artists. You should stop by if you're not too busy settling in. I'd like that, Elena said, surprised to realize how much she meant it. Actually, I applied for a job at an art gallery in town. The Blue Harbor Gallery? Lily's face brightened. That's where I work. I'm the assistant manager. Wait, are you the Elena Morgan who sent in the application with the art history degree from NYU? Tom just mentioned we were interviewing someone new next week. Elena nodded, feeling a flutter of hope. That's me. Well, I shouldn't say anything before your official interview, but between us, we've been desperate for someone with actual art background. Lily winked. Most of our applicants just want summer jobs and can't tell a watercolor from an oil painting. By the time they reached their cottage, the sky was turning pink and orange. Harper, tired from all the excitement, leaned against Elena's side as they climbed the porch steps. I'm hungry, Mom, she yawned. Elena realized they hadn't properly grocery shopped yet. In New York, their kitchen staff would have prepared meals, or they would have ordered from the finest restaurants. How about we walk into town and find some place for dinner? Elena suggested, remembering the small main street they'd driven through earlier. 20 minutes later, they sat in a cozy corner booth at Sandy's Diner, where the waitress called everyone honey and Harper's chocolate milk came in a plastic cup with a smiley face straw. Is your burger good? Elena asked, watching Harper take a big bite. The little girl nodded enthusiastically, ketchup on her chin. Better than Greta used to make. Elena laughed, thinking of their former private chef who had created elaborate gourmet children's meals that Harper had barely touched. Here was her daughter, happily devouring a simple diner burger and French fries. As they walked home in the twilight, Harper's small hand in hers, Elena noticed a black sedan with tinted windows parked near the town's only traffic light. For a moment, her heart raced with paranoia, then she shook it off. Not every luxury car was connected to Richard. Cedar Cove probably had its share of wealthy summer visitors. Can we go to the beach again tomorrow? Harper asked as Elena tucked her into bed in her new room. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and Elena had hung Harper's favorite fairy lights around the window. Of course we can, Elena said, smoothing back her daughter's blonde curls. We can go every day if you want. I like it here, Harper said sleepily. It's small, but it's nice. I like it too, Elena whispered, sitting beside the bed until Harper's breathing grew deep and even. Later, Elena stood on the small porch of their cottage, looking out at the night sky filled with more stars than she'd ever been able to see in New York. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe fully. Their life wouldn't be perfect or easy. She still had to ace her job interview, figure out the school routine, and learn to live without staff handling everything. But it would be real. It would be theirs. A cool breeze blew in from the ocean, and Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a shiver of both excitement and fear. She was finally free, but freedom came with its own kind of uncertainty. As she turned to go inside, she noticed the same black sedan driving slowly past their cottage. This time, the paranoia didn't feel so easily dismissed. Fall had come to Cedar Cove, painting the trees in bright oranges and reds. Elena stood at the window of the Blue Harbor Gallery, arranging a display of local pottery. For the past 6 months, things had gone surprisingly well. She'd gotten the job at the gallery, Harper had settled into school and made friends, and their little blue cottage truly felt like home. The new shipment of sea glass jewelry is here, called Tom, the gallery owner, from the back room. Want to help me unpack it after you've finished the window? Elena smiled. Sure thing. She loved working here, surrounded by beautiful handmade things and people who shared her passion for art. The salary was modest compared to the millions she'd left behind, but it was enough to pay their bills and even save a little. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Lily. Harper had a great time at Penny's birthday party. Dropping her off at your place now. Still good for me to take both girls to the beach later. Elena quickly texted back her thanks. This was another wonderful change in their lives, real friends who helped each other out. In New York, childcare had been a paid service, not something shared among a community of parents. Tom appeared beside her with a cardboard box. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said, his usually cheerful face looking worried. "The gallery's been doing great since you started. Your window displays and social media posts have really brought in customers." "That's good, right?" Elena asked, noticing his frown. Tom sighed. "It would be, except I got a strange offer yesterday. Some big investment company wants to buy the building, offered 3 times what it's worth." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze outside. "Did they say why?" "Something about developing the waterfront. But here's the weird part. They only want this building, not any of the others on the street." Tom shook his head. "I've owned this place for 20 years. I don't want to sell, but that's a lot of money, and my wife's been having health issues." Elena nodded sympathetically, but her mind was racing. This was the third strange thing to happen in the past few weeks. First, Harper had suddenly been rejected from the after-school art program she loved, despite being previously accepted. Then Elena's application to buy their rented cottage had been mysteriously denied, even though her credit was good. "Do you know the name of the company?" she asked casually. "Winterson Holdings, I think. Some New York outfit." Tom started unpacking the jewelry. "Anyway, I told them I'd think about it. Let's get this display set up." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the colorful sea glass necklaces. Winterson Holdings. A slight alteration of Winters. It couldn't be a coincidence. By the time her shift ended at 5, Elena had convinced herself she was being paranoid. Richard wouldn't bother with a small-town art gallery or her cottage rental. He was probably too busy making more billions to even think about her. She walked along the main street toward home, enjoying the crisp fall air and the small-town charm that still delighted her after months in Cedar Cove. The local coffee shop owner waved through the window. 2 older men playing chess outside the hardware store nodded hello. Halfway home, Elena decided to stop at Sandy's diner to pick up dinner. Harper loved their Friday night burger special, and Elena was too tired to cook. "Well, hello there, stranger," called Sandy from behind the counter. The older woman's friendly face was unusually serious today. "Haven't seen you in here lately." "Been busy at the gallery," Elena smiled. "Can I get 2 burger specials to go?" Sandy looked uncomfortable. "I'm real sorry, but we're actually not doing takeout anymore. New policy." Elena looked around the nearly empty diner in confusion. "Since when?" "Since, well, just recently." Sandy wouldn't meet her eyes. "Management decision." "You are the management, Sandy. You own this place." Sandy busied herself wiping the already clean counter. "Things change, that's all." As Elena turned to leave, bewildered, she noticed a familiar black sedan parked across the street. The same type of car she'd spotted occasionally over the past months. Her heart began to pound. Outside, Elena pulled out her phone and called Lily. "Hey, is Harper still with you?" "Yeah, we're building sandcastles. Everything okay? You sound worried." "Everything's fine," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. I think I'll join you guys at the beach instead of meeting at home." As she walked toward the beach, Elena's mind raced through the strange events of the past few weeks. Harper's best friend, Penny, had suddenly stopped coming over after school. The friendly librarian who always saved books for Harper had become oddly distant. Small businesses around town had started finding excuses not to serve them. At the beach, Elena watched Harper playing happily with Lily's daughter. They were digging a moat around a lopsided sandcastle, laughing as the waves occasionally reached far enough to fill it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lily said, handing Elena a cup of coffee from her thermos. Elena took a deep breath. "Lily, have you noticed anything weird lately? People in town acting differently toward us." Lily hesitated. "Actually, yes. I wasn't going to say anything, but Penny's mom told me they can't have play dates with Harper anymore. She wouldn't say why, just that her husband insisted. And Tom's been acting nervous at the gallery whenever you're not around." "And you didn't find that strange?" Elena asked. "Of course I did. But I figured if something was wrong, you'd tell me." Lily looked at her curiously. "Is there something you need to tell me, Elena?" Elena stared out at the ocean, wondering how much to reveal. She'd been careful not to share her past in Cedar Cove, wanting a fresh start without the baggage of being Richard Winter's ex-wife. "Before we moved here, I was married to someone powerful," she said finally. "The divorce wasn't his idea." Lily's eyes widened. "Wait, are you saying your ex is somehow behind all this weird stuff?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, "but the timing is suspicious." On the beach, Harper squealed with delight as a wave filled their sandcastle moat. Her happy face, so different from the quiet, anxious child she'd been in New York, made Elena's chest tighten with resolve. Whatever was happening, she wouldn't let anyone destroy the life they built here. As the sun began to set, they packed up their beach things. Elena took Harper's small, sandy hand in hers, and they walked back toward their cottage with Lily and her daughter. "Mom, can we have burgers for dinner?" Harper asked. "How about we make breakfast for dinner instead?" Elena suggested, remembering Sandy's strange behavior. "Pancakes with chocolate chips." "Yes." Harper jumped excitedly. "Can Penny and Lily stay too?" Elena looked questioningly at Lily, who nodded. "We'd love to." Later that evening, after Harper was asleep and Lily had gone home, Elena sat on her porch, looking out at the dark ocean. She'd been a fool to think Richard would simply let them go. Money couldn't buy him Elena's affection or respect, but it could buy nearly everything else: property, influence, loyalty. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from her bank, confirming that her mortgage application had been denied again. The reason cited was insufficient stability of income. As Elena stared at the screen, another email arrived. This one from Tom at the gallery. "Elena, I'm so sorry. Family emergency means I need to close the gallery for a while. We'll send your final paycheck tomorrow." Elena's hands shook as she set the phone down. The gallery was her only source of income. Without it, she couldn't pay rent, couldn't support Harper, couldn't maintain their new life. In the distance, she saw the now familiar black sedan parked at the end of their street. This time, it didn't drive away. This time, Elena knew it was waiting, watching her world crumble piece by piece. Richard was making his point. "You can leave me, but you can't escape me. You can reject my money, but you can't live without it. Come back, or I'll take everything, including Harper." Elena wrapped her arms around herself against the cold night air. In New York, she'd left a golden cage. Here in Cedar Cove, she'd found freedom and happiness. But now it seemed Richard had simply been building a different kind of cage around them, piece by piece, waiting for the perfect moment to snap it shut. Rain pattered against the windows of the blue cottage as Elena helped Harper with her homework at the kitchen table. Outside, the October sky had turned dark early, and the wind was picking up, rattling the loose shutter that Elena had been meaning to fix. "And then you add these numbers together," Elena explained, pointing to the simple math problem in Harper's workbook. "See how that works?" Harper nodded, her face serious with concentration as she carefully wrote the answer. In the 2 weeks since the gallery had closed, Elena had been spending more time with Harper, which was the one silver lining to her increasingly desperate situation. Their savings wouldn't last much longer, and despite sending out dozens of job applications, Elena hadn't received a single call for an interview. "Good job, sweetheart," Elena said as Harper correctly solved the problem. "Just 3 more and then we can have hot chocolate." The sound of car tires on wet gravel made Elena glance out the window. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the sleek black Bentley pulling up in front of their cottage. It had been nearly 8 months since she'd seen that car. "Harper, why don't you finish these problems in your room?" "I'll call you when the hot chocolate is ready," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we always do homework together," Harper protested. "I know, but someone's here to see me. It won't take long." Elena forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Harper gathered her books reluctantly and headed to her room, just as a firm knock sounded at the front door. Elena took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and went to answer it. Richard Winters stood on her porch, impeccably dressed in a dark suit and overcoat that probably cost more than 3 months' rent on the cottage. His hair was perfectly styled despite the rain, and his familiar cologne, expensive and subtle, drifted into the small living room as Elena stepped back to let him in. "Elena," he said with a nod. His blue eyes, so like Harper's, swept around the cottage, taking in the one furniture, the simple decorations, the signs of a life so different from the one they'd shared in Manhattan. "What are you doing here, Richard?" Elena asked, crossing her arms over her chest. He removed his coat and draped it carefully over the back of a chair. "I was in Boston for meetings. Thought I'd drive up and see Harper in person. Our video calls aren't quite the same." Elena knew better than to believe this explanation. Richard never did anything without multiple purposes. "You've been having me watched," she said. It wasn't a question. Monitored would be a more accurate term. He ran a finger along the bookshelf, examining the dust. "Making sure my daughter is safe. And making sure local businesses won't serve us. Making sure I can't get a mortgage or keep a job. Is that for Harper's safety too?" Elena kept her voice low, aware that Harper might be listening. Richard's face remained impassive, but a small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "I see you've noticed some changes around town. It was you, Winterson Holdings." "One of my smaller subsidiaries, yes." Richard sat down on the couch without being invited. "I'm a businessman, Elena. I make investments where I see potential." "You're trying to drive us out," Elena said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're systematically destroying everything we've built here." "I prefer to think of it as demonstrating a point." Richard straightened the cuff of his shirt. "The point being that your little experiment in independence was always going to fail." From down the hall came the sound of Harper's bedroom door opening. A moment later, she appeared in the living room doorway, her eyes widening in surprise. "Daddy?" Her voice was uncertain, caught between excitement and confusion. Richard's face transformed, softening into a genuine smile as he stood and opened his arms. "There's my girl." Harper ran to him, allowing herself to be swept up in a hug. Elena watched, her heart aching at the sight. Despite everything, Richard was still Harper's father, and she loved him. "I brought you something," Richard said, reaching into his suit pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to Harper. Inside was a miniature dollhouse, exquisitely crafted with tiny rooms that exactly matched their old penthouse in New York. The detail was remarkable, tiny replicas of Harper's old bedroom, the kitchen where their chef had prepared meals, the living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows. "It's our home," Harper said in wonder, examining each tiny piece of furniture. "Our real home," Richard corrected, shooting a pointed look at Elena. "Not this temporary situation." Elena felt her chest tighten with anger and fear. "Harper, why don't you take your present to your room while I talk to Daddy?" Once Harper had reluctantly left with her dollhouse, Elena turned to Richard. "That was low, even for you. Just reminding her of what she's missing." Richard walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden. "And I wanted to see for myself the conditions my daughter is living in. A leaky roof, peeling paint, and what looks like mold in the corner of that ceiling." He pointed upward. "Not exactly the environment I want for my child." "She's happy here," Elena said. "Happier than she ever was in New York." "Is she?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "No more private tutors, no more ballet lessons with Madame Petrova, no more weekends at the country club. Just a failing public school and playdates with children who will never amount to anything." Elena felt her temper rising. Those children who will never amount to anything are her friends. Real friends, not just the kids of your business associates. Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Friends come and go. Education and opportunity shape a lifetime. Harper deserves the best, and this," he gestured around the cottage, "is far from the best." "What do you want, Richard?" Elena asked tiredly. "Just stay it." "The experiments have proven my point," he said coldly. "You can't provide Harper with the life she deserves. Come back to New York, and this all stops. Stay here, and I'll buy every business in this town until you have nowhere left to go." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "You think I'd come back to you after this? After you've shown exactly why I left in the first place?" "Not to me," Richard clarified. "To New York. To the life you left. You can have your own apartment, complete independence. All I ask is that Harper attends the right schools and has the advantages of my name and position. And if I refuse—" Richard reached into his coat pocket and removed a thick envelope, which he placed on the coffee table between them. "Then I'll be forced to take more direct action." Elena picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out the legal documents inside. Her breath caught as she read the heading, "Petition for Modification of Custody." "You're trying to take Harper from me," she whispered, shock making her voice shake. "I'm ensuring my daughter receives the upbringing she deserves," Richard corrected. "The courts tend to favor stability, proper education, and financial security when determining a child's best interests. All things you currently lack. Because you've deliberately created that instability." Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You've sabotaged everything we've built here." "Can you prove that?" Richard asked mildly. "Or will it just sound like the paranoid accusations of a mother who's struggling to provide basic necessities for her child?" Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she read further into the documents. Richard's lawyers had built a case portraying her as financially unstable, isolating Harper from educational opportunities, and denying her the benefits of her father's resources out of spite. "You won't get away with this," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I already have." Richard picked up his coat. "I'm staying at the Harbor Inn tonight. Harper is welcome to have dinner with me there. They have an excellent chef." "Of course, you're invited too." "How generous of you," Elena said bitterly. Richard paused at the door. "One more thing. You have 2 weeks to decide. After that, these papers get filed, and we let the courts decide Harper's future. I think we both know how that will go." He gestured around the small cottage. "A struggling single mother with no job, no prospects, and a history of walking away from financial security. Against a father who can provide every advantage." He shook his head. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Elena." After he left, Elena sank onto the couch, the custody papers clutched in her hand. Through the thin walls, she could hear Harper in her room, talking to the dolls in her new miniature penthouse. The sound broke her heart. The rain continued to fall outside, matching the tears that slid silently down Elena's cheeks. She had left New York to give Harper a more authentic, loving life. Now Richard was using that very choice to paint her as an unfit mother. The cruelest part was that he might succeed. With his money and influence, he could outlast her in court battles, hire the best lawyers, and manipulate public opinion. Meanwhile, she could barely afford next month's rent. Elena wiped her eyes as she heard Harper's footsteps coming down the hall. She quickly tucked the custody papers out of sight. Whatever she decided, her daughter didn't need to know how close she was to losing everything, including her. "Mom." Harper stood in the doorway, the dollhouse in her hands. "Daddy says I can have dinner with him at a fancy restaurant tonight. Can I go?" "He says you can come too." Elena looked at her daughter's hopeful face and felt the weight of Richard's ultimatum crushing down on her. No matter what she chose, someone would lose. The only question was who would suffer more: Harper, denied her father's advantages, or Elena, forced back into a world she'd fought so hard to escape. "Let me think about it, sweetie," she managed to say. "How about that hot chocolate now?" As she heated milk on the stove, Elena stared out the window at the black Bentley still parked across the street. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of everything Richard represented: power, control, wealth, and the belief that everything and everyone had a price. The problem was, he might be right. Elena sat in the back of the small courtroom, clutching her worn leather purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. The preliminary custody hearing was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, and her lawyer, Patricia Jones, was reviewing documents beside her. Patricia was the best Elena could afford, a decent local attorney who typically handled divorces and simple custody arrangements, not battles against billionaires. Across the aisle sat Richard's legal team, 3 expensive-looking lawyers in perfect suits, surrounded by stacks of color-coded files and sleek laptops. Richard himself sat confidently among them, scrolling through his phone as if this were just another business meeting, not a fight for his daughter. "Remember," Patricia whispered, "stick to the facts. Don't let emotion overwhelm you, even when they make accusations. The judge needs to see you as stable and reasonable." Elena nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. The 2 weeks Richard had given her to decide had passed without her agreeing to his terms. So here they were, in a small Massachusetts courtroom, about to battle over Harper's future. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Elena turned to see Lily slip into a seat behind her. Her friend gave her an encouraging smile and a thumbs up. The small gesture of support brought tears to Elena's eyes that she quickly blinked away. She couldn't afford to appear emotional today. "All rise," the court officer announced as the judge entered. a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. As the proceedings began, Richard's lead attorney painted a picture of Elena as a woman who had irresponsibly rejected financial security, dragged her child away from educational opportunities, and was now unable to provide even basic stability. He presented financial records showing Elena's dwindling bank account, documentation of her job loss, and the mortgage rejection letters. "Your Honor," the sleek attorney said, "Ms. Morgan has consistently placed her own desire for a simpler life above her daughter's best interests. The child has been removed from one of the finest private schools in Manhattan to attend an underfunded public school. She has lost access to cultural enrichment, proper health care, and the stability that Mr. Winter's financial resources provide." Elena felt sick as she listened. Everything was being twisted. Her desire to give Harper a more loving, authentic childhood was portrayed as selfish neglect. Her rejection of Richard's money was framed as reckless endangerment of Harper's future. When Patricia rose to present Elena's side, she did her best with limited resources. She submitted Harper's improved school reports showing better social adjustment and academic progress. She had Lily testify about Harper's happiness in Cedar Cove and her thriving friendships. But without proof of Richard's interference in their lives, Elena's claims sounded, as Richard had predicted, like paranoid excuses for her own failures. During a break in the proceedings, Elena stepped into the hallway for air, her head spinning. Richard approached, standing close enough that only she could hear his words. "This can still be avoided," he said quietly. "Come back to New York. Harper in the right schools, you with your own comfortable life. Everyone wins." "Everyone except Harper," Elena replied. "She's happy here, Richard. Truly happy for the first time. She's 6 years old. She doesn't know what's best for her future." Richard straightened his already perfect tie. "I'm trying to protect her from your idealistic notions about small-town life." "You're trying to control us both," Elena said. "That's all this has ever been about. Control." Richard's face hardened. "I have responsibilities to my daughter that go beyond your sentimental ideas about childhood. Harper is a Winters. She has a legacy to live up to." Before Elena could respond, a reporter approached them, notebook in hand. "Mrs. Winters, sorry, Ms. Morgan, would you care to comment on today's proceedings?" Elena was about to decline when she realized this might be an opportunity. "Actually, yes. I'd like to explain why I left New York and what my ex-husband is really doing to our lives in Cedar Cove." The reporter's eyes lit up at the promise of a juicy story, and Richard's face showed momentary alarm before smoothing into his media-perfect smile. "I'm sure we all look forward to hearing Ms. Morgan's creative interpretations of events," he said smoothly before walking away. The next morning, Elena's story appeared in a small regional paper under the headline, "Billionaire's ex-wife claims harassment in small-town custody battle." The article was sympathetic, portraying Elena as David fighting Goliath, a mother seeking a better life for her child against the crushing power of wealth and influence. The story was picked up by larger papers, then by a popular women's blog, then by national news outlets. Suddenly, what Richard had hoped would be a quiet legal matter became a public narrative about wealth, power, and a mother's rights. People debated online whether Elena was a hero standing up to privilege or a fool rejecting opportunities most could only dream of. For a brief, heady moment, public opinion seemed to be on Elena's side. Strangers sent encouraging messages. A few local businesses in Cedar Cove quietly reached out, offering to help prove Richard's interference if they could remain anonymous. Tom from the gallery called to say he might be willing to testify about the pressure to sell his business. But Richard's PR team quickly countered with their own narrative, planting stories that questioned Elena's mental stability. Old college photos appeared showing Elena at parties. Medical records from her brief struggle with postpartum depression were somehow leaked. Cherry-picked quotes from former household staff painted her as moody and difficult. Worst of all, they began portraying Cedar Cove as a backward town with failing schools and limited opportunities, a place a caring parent would never choose for their child. Local officials, eager for the investment Richard hinted might come their way, began distancing themselves from Elena. 6 weeks into the legal battle, Elena sat at her kitchen table late at night, sorting through bills she couldn't pay and legal documents she barely understood. Her savings were nearly gone. Patricia had reduced her fees out of sympathy, but even that wouldn't last much longer. Richard, meanwhile, could sustain this fight indefinitely. Harper, picking up on the tension despite Elena's efforts to shield her, had started having nightmares again, something that hadn't happened since they left New York. After attending another fancy dinner with her father at the Harbor Inn, she'd come home with questions that broke Elena's heart. "Why can't we have nice things like at Daddy's hotel?" she'd asked. "Penny's mom said you might have to give me to Daddy because you don't have enough money. Is that true?" Elena had reassured her as best she could, but the question lingered between them, unanswered because Elena herself didn't know the truth anymore. A knock at the door startled Elena from her worries. It was past 10, too late for casual visitors. Heart pounding, she approached the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. On her porch stood a woman she recognized from photos but had never met in person, Sophia Winters, Richard's first wife. Elena opened the door, confused. "Mrs. Winters." The elegant woman smiled slightly. "I haven't been Mrs. Winters for 12 years. Please, call me Sophia. May I come in?" "I think we have a lot to talk about, specifically how to beat Richard at his own game." For the first time in weeks, Elena felt a tiny flicker of hope as she stepped back to let Sophia enter. Perhaps David had found a slingshot after all. The courthouse buzzed with whispers as Elena walked down the center aisle toward her seat. Unlike the quiet first hearing, today's final custody decision had drawn a crowd. Sophia Winters walked confidently beside her, dressed in an elegant but understated suit. Behind them came Tom from the gallery and 3 other Cedar Cove business owners, all finally willing to testify about Richard's interference in their lives. "Remember, keep your head high," Sophia murmured. "Richard hates public embarrassment more than anything else." Elena nodded, taking strength from the woman who had once been in her exact position. In the 3 weeks since Sophia had shown up at her door, everything had changed. Richard's first wife had brought not just moral support but evidence, years of documented patterns showing how Richard controlled, manipulated, and eventually discarded people who defied him. At the front of the courtroom, Richard sat with his lawyers, his face betraying a flicker of surprise at Sophia's presence. Elena noticed with satisfaction that for once he looked less than perfectly composed. "All rise," called the court officer as Judge Linda Wilson entered the courtroom. The proceedings began with Richard's attorney summarizing their case. Elena was financially unstable, Cedar Cove lacked educational opportunities, and Harper's best interests would be served by returning to New York under Richard's primary custody. Then it was Elena's turn. Her new lawyer, Diane Chen, hired with funds Sophia had helped arrange, approached the bench with confident steps. "Your Honor, this case isn't about a mother's financial instability. It's about a pattern of deliberate sabotage by a man who believes his wealth gives him the right to control others." Diane's voice was clear and strong. "Today, we will present evidence that Mr. Winters systematically destroyed Ms. Morgan's livelihood, housing security, and community standing through covert pressure and financial manipulation." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Tom took the stand, explaining how Richard's company had threatened his family business. Sandy from the diner testified about the mysterious investor who had suddenly bought her building and tripled her rent after she served Elena and Harper. The school principal described the sudden withdrawal of a promised donation after Harper was accepted to the after-school program. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. During a brief recess, an elegant older woman had slipped into the courtroom and now approached Elena's attorney, requesting to speak. "Your Honor," Diane said when court resumed, "we'd like to call a final witness, Mrs. Dorothy Winters." Richard's face went pale as his mother walked to the witness stand. The silver-haired woman, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with quiet dignity, had not spoken to her son in public for nearly a decade. "Mrs. Winters," Diane began, "can you describe your relationship with your son?" Dorothy Winters looked directly at Richard as she spoke. "My son learned his controlling behaviors from his father, my late husband. I left that marriage when Richard was 15, after 20 years of psychological control disguised as concern for my well-being." Her voice remained steady. Since then, I've watched Richard repeat those same patterns in his business and personal relationships. She described how Richard had tried to control her access to family money after his father's death, how he'd interfered when she tried to establish her own charitable foundation, and how he'd eventually cut her off when she refused to follow his wishes. "I love my son," she said, her voice softening, "but I cannot stay silent while he does to his daughter and ex-wife what was done to me." During cross-examination, Richard's attorneys tried to suggest Dorothy was a bitter, estranged mother with a grudge, but her calm, factual responses only reinforced her credibility. When it was time for Harper to speak with the judge in her chambers, Elena felt sick with worry. They had prepared the little girl as best they could, explaining that she should just tell the truth about how she felt, but Richard had spent the past weeks showering Harper with expensive gifts and promises of a perfect life in New York. While they waited, Richard approached Elena in the hallway. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "My mother, that was unexpected." "I didn't ask her to come," Elena replied truthfully. "Unlike you, I don't manipulate people." Richard's eyes narrowed. "This public spectacle won't change anything. The judge will still see that I can provide Harper with opportunities you can't match." "Maybe," Elena said. "But now she'll also see exactly who you are." When Judge Wilson called them back into the courtroom, Harper was already sitting in the front row, her small legs swinging nervously. She gave Elena a tiny smile that made her heart swell with hope. Judge Wilson looked at both parents over her reading glasses. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence, including my conversation with Harper." She paused. "This case presents unusual circumstances. On one hand, we have a father with vast financial resources and educational opportunities. On the other, a mother who has created a nurturing community environment where the child has thrived emotionally." She shuffled her papers. "What troubles this court are the documented attempts to create artificial hardship in Ms. Morgan's life in order to manufacture a custody advantage. Such manipulation is not in a child's best interest and raises serious questions about Mr. Winter's approach to parenting." Richard sat up straighter. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but he waved him off. After careful consideration, the judge continued, "This court finds that primary physical custody will remain with Ms. Morgan, with Mr. Winters granted generous visitation rights, contingent upon his completion of family therapy sessions to address controlling behaviors." Elena felt tears of relief well in her eyes as the judge continued. "Furthermore, Mr. Winters will establish an educational trust for Harper that neither parent can directly control. Ms. Morgan will receive additional settlement funds to ensure stable housing and employment, free from interference. Both parents will share legal custody and major decisions regarding Harper's upbringing." As the judge finished reading her decision, Elena looked at Harper, who was smiling with relief. Across the aisle, Richard sat motionless, his face unreadable. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, hoping for statements from both parties. Richard slipped out a side entrance, avoiding questions, while Elena stopped briefly. "All I've ever wanted is for my daughter to be happy and healthy," she told the cameras. "Today's decision allows her to have both the loving community we've built in Cedar Cove and the opportunities her father's resources can provide. This isn't about winning or losing, it's about finding balance." 3 months later, Elena stood on the porch of a small house near the ocean, not their rented blue cottage. This one was painted a warm yellow, and Elena owned it outright, thanks to the court-ordered settlement. The gallery had reopened under her management after Tom decided to retire and sell the business to her. Harper ran across the lawn with her friends, including Penny, whose parents had finally stood up to Richard's pressure once the court case became public. The spring air was filled with children's laughter and the smell of the barbecue Lily was tending in the backyard. Inside the house, hanging over the fireplace, was Harper's first real painting, a colorful scene showing 2 houses. One was a towering skyscraper in New York, where she now spent 1 weekend a month with her father. The other was their yellow house by the sea. In the painting, they weren't separate worlds anymore, but connected by a rainbow bridge that Harper could cross whenever she wanted. Richard had changed too, in small ways that surprised Elena. The family therapy sessions, which he'd initially approached with skepticism, seemed to be having an effect. His time with Harper became less about expensive outings and more about actual connection. He'd even visited their new house once, uncomfortable but trying, for Harper's birthday party. As Elena watched her daughter play from the porch, Dorothy Winters joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You know," the older woman said, "I think you've given my son something no one else could." A chance to break the cycle. Elena smiled. "I hope so. For Harper's sake." "And for his," Dorothy added. "Controlling everything and everyone isn't freedom. It's its own kind of prison." Elena nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She had left Richard's world of wealth believing money was the problem, only to discover that true freedom wasn't found in either extreme wealth or its prideful rejection. It lived in the messy middle ground where authenticity and love could flourish. The divorce had cost her a fortune, but given her something far more valuable: the space to discover that happiness required both material security and emotional richness. As Harper ran up the porch steps, cheeks flushed with excitement, Elena opened her arms. This moment of genuine joy was the true wealth she'd been seeking all along.